Today we're looking at a set of historical documents, some economic analyses, and they paint a picture of a world that honestly sounds almost impossible to modern ears.
It really does.
It's one of those topics where, the more you read, the more you just find yourself asking, wait, why don't we do it this way anymore?
It definitely challenges a lot of our basic assumptions about how a society should function. I mean, we're so used to a certain way of doing things, taxes, government budgets, all these safety nets, and we just sort of assume that's the only way you could build a civilization. But the sources today show a completely different blueprint.
Exactly. So, to get us started, I want to pull a scene, a really vivid scene, right from the source material. I want you to just picture this.
But
It's February. The year is 1557. You're in Istanbul. It is freezing cold. The wind's cutting right off the Bosphorus, and you're broke.
Oh,
You haven't eaten in 2 days. You have no money, no connections, nothing.
not a good position to be in. In most cities, in most of history, that's a recipe for starvation.
Right. But then you catch a scent on the wind. It smells like hot lentil soup and fresh baked bread. You follow your nose down a cobblestone street to this massive stone complex. You walk through the gates. A man in a clean apron sits you down at a long wooden table. He puts a steaming bowl of soup in front of you, gives you a whole loaf of bread. You eat until you're full, and you get up and you leave.
And here's the kicker, right? No one asks you for money. No one asks your name. No one asks to see your ID card or your tax returns.
No questions asked.
And this is crucial. No one even asks if you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish. You're hungry, so you eat. End of story.
And if you looked out the window of that soup kitchen, you might see a boy across the street getting a free eye exam at a hospital. Next door, a scholar is copying manuscripts in a library. And every single one of these services, the food, the doctor, the books, was free.
It really sounds like a fantasy, but this was the economic reality for millions of people for centuries.
And the wildest part, the government didn't pay for any of it. There was no Ministry of Welfare collecting income tax to fund that soup kitchen.
That is the key. That's the whole mechanism we need to understand today. We're talking about the whack.
The whack. Now, for anyone listening who's maybe heard this term but isn't sure what it is or maybe never heard it at all, our mission today is to unpack how this specific legal mechanism basically created a private welfare state that ran for over 1,000 years.
And we're not just talking about a few scattered charities here.
Not at all. We're talking about an economic engine that owned a huge chunk of all the real estate in the Middle East.
It's a massive topic. To really get it, you have to look at law, economics, and theology all kind of wrapped into one system. This wasn't just being nice. It was a really sophisticated institutional framework.
So let's start with the basics. The word itself, whack. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced whack. What does it actually mean?
Yeah, to understand the economics, you have to understand the language first. In Arabic, whack literally means to stop, or to detain, or to withhold.
To stop. That seems, counterintuitive for an economic engine. Usually you want assets to move, to flow.
It makes sense when you look at the legal mechanics of it. When you create a Waqf, you're taking a productive asset, a building, a farm, a shop, and you are stopping it from ever being sold again, or gifted, or inherited, or divided. You detain the asset, and you dedicate its revenue to a purpose. Forever.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Let's say I'm a wealthy merchant in, 16th century Baghdad. I own a bakery. I decide to turn it into a Waqf. Do I still own the bakery?
No. And this is the radical part. You no longer own it. But, and this is so important, the state doesn't own it either.
So who does?
In the eyes of Islamic law, the ownership is transferred to God. The asset is suspended in this kind of legal amber. It creates a whole separate legal entity, almost like a modern trust, that exists completely outside of you and outside of the government.
It's irrevocable.
Completely. Once you sign the deed, which is called the waqiyah, you can't wake up a year later and say, you know what, I'm a bit short on cash, I think I'll sell the bakery.
Yeah.
It's gone. It's now a permanent institution.
That sounds incredibly risky for the person donating. I mean, why would anyone do that? I get the charity part, helping the poor is great, but to permanently lock away your wealth like that, it seems extreme.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources point to two main motivations that drove this entire system. The first one is, well, it's obviously religious. The whole concept is based on a saying of the Prophet Muhammad about continuing charity, sadaqah jariyah.
Ah, the idea of a legacy that outlives you.
Exactly. The belief is that when a person dies, their deeds stop. They can't earn any more spiritual credit, so to speak, except for three things. And one of those is a charity that continues to benefit people long after the donor is gone. If that bakery you mentioned feeds the poor for 500 years, you get the spiritual credit for all 500 of those years. It's an investment in the afterlife.
Okay, that makes sense on a spiritual level, but you said two motivations. What's the second?
The second is much more pragmatic. It's about asset protection.
How does giving your property away protect it?
Well, think about the political environment in the medieval Middle East, or really anywhere in the pre-modern world. Rulers could be arbitrary.
Sure.
If you were a wealthy merchant who fell out of favor, the Sultan could just wake up one morning and decide to confiscate all your private property. But if that property is Waqf,
It belongs to God.
right, and even the most tyrannical ruler is going to hesitate to seize property that legally belongs to God, it would be a massive political and religious scandal. So creating a Waqf was a way for wealthy families to shield their assets from state confiscation.
That is fascinating. So it's a mix of genuine piety and just really shrewd financial planning.
Precisely. And that combination is what drove this explosion in endowments. It all started with a single well in Medina in the 7th century, the Well of Ruma, which was bought by the Prophet's companion Uthman ibn Affan for the community, and it just scaled up until it covered the entire map.
Let's talk about that scale, because I think when people hear charity, they think small, a bake sale or a local food drive. But the reading suggests something much, much bigger.
Oh, much bigger.
Right.
By the late Ottoman period, some historical estimates suggest that roughly 1/3 of all productive agricultural land in the entire empire was Waqf land.
1/3. Hold on. That's 33% of the economy.
Yeah. Imagine if 30% of the real estate in Manhattan or London today was owned by nonprofits and was dedicated solely to public service. That is the kind of scale we're talking about.
Wow.
In some cities, like Istanbul or Aleppo, it was even higher. The city centers, the main markets, the bathhouses, the warehouses were almost entirely Waqf properties.
So this wasn't some side project. This was civil society effectively running the country's infrastructure.
It totally changes how you view history. We tend to assume that big infrastructure, hospitals, universities, bridges, water systems has always been the job of the state.
Of course.
But for centuries in the Islamic world, the state's job was mostly defense, warfare, and the courts. Pretty much everything else, education, health, welfare, even municipal water, was funded by these private endowments.
A completely decentralized welfare state?
Exactly. It was the wealthy and even the middle class voluntarily transferring their private wealth into public trust to literally build the civilization they were living in.
Okay, so I want to get into the nuts and bolts of the money. Because free soup sounds great, but lentils cost money. Cooks need salaries. Buildings need repairs. How did the math actually work to keep this going for centuries?
This is the most brilliant part of the system. This is where the economic engine idea really comes in. A Waqf isn't a donation box where you put money in and it eventually runs out.
It's a capital asset.
It's a capital asset. It generates its own income. A typical Waqf has two distinct parts. First, you have the khairat, that's the charitable service, the mosque, the school, the hospital. That part loses money. It's the cost center.
Okay. Makes sense.
But to support that, you endow a second part,
Yep.
the akwar, the revenue-generating assets. So you might build a school, but to fund it, you also donate, say, a block of shops, a public bathhouse, 2 orchards, and maybe a mill.
So the shops are just regular commercial businesses.
Yes, exactly. They're run for profit, they charge market rent, they sell their goods at market prices, they compete with other businesses. But the key difference is the profit from those shops doesn't go to a private landlord. It is legally bound to flow directly to the school.
It's capitalism funding charity.
It's a perfect self-sustaining loop. The deed, the waqiyah, acts like a corporate charter and specifies exactly how the money flows. It'll say something like, pay the teacher 50 coins, pay the cleaner 10 coins, buy olive oil for the lamps, pay for roof repairs, and use whatever is left for student meals.
But I see a potential flaw here. What happens if the shops fail? If the market shifts and nobody wants to rent those shops anymore, the school loses all its funding.
That's a real risk, absolutely. And that's why the smartest donors practice diversification. A large Waqf wouldn't just own one little shop, it would own a whole portfolio. Some farmland over here, a mill, a residential building, maybe even a share in a trade caravan.
That sounds suspiciously like a modern investment portfolio.
It's remarkably similar. They understood risk management. And because these institutions were designed to last forever, they created what you could call institutional immortality. Just look at Al-Azhar University in Cairo.
Founded in what, 970 CE?
Yes, it's over 1,000 years old. It has survived the Fatimids, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, Napoleon, the British occupation, modern revolutions. Why? Because it had an independent endowment. It didn't rely on the yearly government budget, so it couldn't be easily shut down just because a new ruler came to power or the state treasury was empty.
That independence is just so powerful. It makes the whole institution incredibly resilient. But let's zoom in on one of these mega WAFs. The source material spends a lot of time on the Suleymaniye Complex in Istanbul. This sounds like it was a city within a city.
It really was. Built in the 1550s by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And yet, it's a perfect example of a complex. It had a huge mosque, of course, but also 4 colleges, a medical school, a hospital, a soup kitchen, a hospice for travelers, a public bath.
And all of this was free to the public.
Services were free. The staff, however, were all paid professionals.
I was really struck by the details on the healthcare. I mean, usually when I think of 16th century medicine, I think of leeches and, pretty grim outcomes. But the reading says the hospital at Suleymaniye was doing things that seem very modern.
The medical care is a fantastic example of the system's sophistication. The deed for that hospital specified that they had to hire a chief physician, surgeons, oculist eye doctors, and pharmacists. They even had a specialized diet kitchen to prepare food according to a patient's specific medical needs.
Wow.
Low salt, specific broths, things like that.
But the part that really got me was the mental health care.
This is a major contrast with what was happening in Europe at the time. In the 16th century, in many parts of London or Paris, the mentally ill were often treated as if they were possessed or as criminals, chained up in places like Bedlam.
And at the Suleymaniye.
They had a dedicated ward for psychological disorders. They used music therapy. The architecture itself was designed with fountains and special acoustics to create a soothing environment. The WAC deed literally budgeted for musicians to be hired to play for the patients to help lower their anxiety.
That is incredible. Music therapy in 1555. And this wasn't just for the rich, for the elite.
No, and that's the other critical point. The deed would often use the phrase "likol man," which means for everyone. We have records of Jewish and Christian patients being treated right alongside Muslims in these hospitals. The biological reality of sickness superseded religious boundaries. The deed said treat the sick, not treat the believer.
It sounds almost utopian, but I have to play the skeptic here. Humans are involved, money is involved. There had to be corruption, right? Who was watching the cash register?
You're right to be skeptical. It wasn't perfect. The system had a specific role called the Nazir, the administrator. This was the person who managed the properties, collected the rents, paid the salaries.
And I'm guessing the Nazir sometimes paid himself a little extra.
It happened, for sure. Sometimes the Nazir would rent the Waqf property to his brother for a discount, or he'd neglect repairs to pocket the difference. But there was a check on this. The Qadi, the judge. Because the Waqf is a legal entity, it has legal standing. Any citizen could sue the Nazir for mismanagement.
So there was public oversight.
Yes. The Ottoman court records are full of cases where locals dragged a corrupt administrator to court. They'd bring evidence and say, he isn't feeding the poor like the deed says, or the roof of the school is leaking and he won't fix it. If it was proven, the judge would fire the Nazir. It was a regulated system with real accountability.
I want to pivot to another aspect of this that the reading highlighted, which is the role of women. History so often writes women out of the economic picture, especially in this period. But the Waqf records seem to tell a very different story.
A huge exception. In many European legal systems at the time, when a woman married, her property basically became her husband's. She lost all economic agency.
Right.
Islamic law was different. Women retained their property rights even after marriage. They could buy, sell, and this is the crucial part, they could endow.
So we actually see women founding some of these massive institutions.
Absolutely. In some cities, in some periods, up to 30 or even 40% of all new Waqfs were established by women.
That is a significant chunk of the economy.
It's huge. Take Kasaki Sultan, also known as Hurrem Sultan. She was the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. She established this massive complex in Jerusalem, a soup kitchen and a hostel that fed hundreds of people every single day. And she didn't just put her name on it. She funded it with her own assets, and she dictated the terms of the deed herself.
It's a level of female economic power that I just don't think we talk about enough. They were literally shaping the cities they lived in.
Exactly. If you walk through Aleppo or Cairo in the 1700s, a significant portion of the infrastructure you saw, the fountains, the local schools, the markets, was built and funded by women. It completely reshapes our understanding of their role in society.
Speaking of infrastructure, I love the smaller examples too. The water fountains.
The sebels, you see them all over the old cities. Just a small stone kiosk with a grilled window where water was handed out for free to anyone walking by.
And some of those are still working, aren't they?
Yes, you can find fountains in Jerusalem or Damascus where the water's still flowing today because an endowment was set up 600 or 700 years ago to pay for the pipes and the maintenance. Such a tangible legacy. You can literally wash your hands in 700-year-old charity.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We have this robust, decentralized, private system that runs a huge chunk of society. It works for 1,000 years. It builds the schools, the hospitals, the water systems. But we don't use the system today. I mean, we have taxes, government ministries. So what happened? Did it just fail on its own?
It didn't just fail, it was dismantled. And the main driver of that dismantling was the transition to the modern state, particularly under colonialism.
How so?
Well, when the British, French, and Italians expanded into the Middle East and North Africa in the 19th century, they came across the Waqf system and they absolutely hated it.
Why? I mean, did they oppose the charity part of it?
No, it wasn't about the charity. They opposed the fact that they couldn't tax it.
Ah, follow the money.
Always. To a colonial administrator, Waqf land was what they called dead capital. It was exempt from property taxes. It couldn't be bought and sold freely on the market. It basically blocked the kind of capitalist extraction and revenue generation they wanted to set up.
So what did they do?
They passed laws to break it. In French Algeria, for example, the colonial administration made it incredibly difficult to establish new waqfs and simply seized control of existing ones. They argued that these dead hands were holding back economic progress.
Dead hand? That's a pretty harsh term.
It's actually a legal term, mort main, in French. The idea that the hand of the dead donor is still controlling the property from beyond the grave, preventing the living from using it dynamically. The modernizers just wanted the state and the free market to control the economy, not ancient deeds.
So they basically nationalized the assets.
Yes, and in many countries, even after independence, the new national governments continued the trend. They said, we will take the land, and we will now take responsibility for the schools and hospitals. They absorbed all the Waqf properties into a new ministry of Waqf.
And that just broke the link.
It broke the entire mechanism. Instead of a bakery's profits funding the school directly, now the bakery's revenue went into the general government pot, and the school had to beg the government for a budget every year.
And we all know what happens when government budgets get tight.
Exactly. The maintenance stops. The quality of service drops. The institutional immortality was lost because the financial independence was gone. The decentralized safety net was replaced by a centralized bureaucracy.
That feels like a real tragedy of continuity. But the reading does mention that the concept isn't entirely dead. It draws a really interesting comparison between the Waqf and modern foundations.
Absolutely. If you look at the structure of, say, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation or the Wellcome Trust in the UK, it is technically the same mechanic. You take a massive block of capital, you invest it, and you use the returns from that investment for public good.
We tend to think of that as a Western invention, like the Carnegie Libraries.
But the Waqf predates those by a millennium. In fact, there's a strong argument among some historians that the very concept of the charitable trust in English law was actually influenced by the Waqf institutions that Crusaders encountered in the Middle East. Oxford and Cambridge colleges operate very much like Waqf-endowed property-supporting scholars.
So the DNA of the system is still with us. Is there any movement to bring back the original Waqf model in the region?
There is, yeah. In Islamic finance today, there's a revival of something called the cash waqf. Since most people don't own huge tracts of land to donate anymore, they pool cash together into an investment fund that then acts as the endowment.
Like a mutual fund for charity.
That's a great way to put it. In Malaysia and some Gulf states, they're using this to fund microfinance for the poor or to build new community infrastructure. It's an attempt to reclaim that third sector, a safety net that isn't the government and isn't the for-profit market.
That really brings us to the big takeaway for me. We live in a time where we're constantly arguing about the size of government, tax the rich versus small government. But the history of the Waqf shows us a third option.
It challenges that binary, doesn't it?
Right.
We assume that if the government doesn't solve a problem, it just won't get solved. The Waqf proves that a society can organize itself to solve massive problems: healthcare, education, hunger through permanent, irrevocable private generosity.
It redefines what public service means. It doesn't have to mean state service.
And it suggests that maybe we've lost something by relying so heavily on the tax and spend model. That personal connection, the spiritual dimension of giving, the local control, those were all features of the Waqf that a centralized bureaucracy really struggles to replicate.
It's a heavy thought. We went from a bowl of soup on a cold morning in 1557 all the way to rethinking the entire structure of the modern welfare state.
That's the power of looking backward, Sometimes the solutions to our future problems are hiding in the past.
So here's the question we want to leave you with today. If you could create a Waqf right now, if you could lock away an asset to solve one single problem forever with no government interference, what would it be? And could we build a modern version of that safety net that could last for the next 1,000 years?
It is certainly worth thinking about.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening to the story of the economy that built a civilization. Catch you on the next one.